Locked in my shed, I spot two shadowy figures with bolt cutters on my security cam. 3 a.m., right where I dug up a sealed concrete slab. A black SUV circles my house 3 times that night. No plates, no trace. HOA Karen scared, not smug, and a cop's asking questions. What's under my land that's got them watching? Stick around, this gets deep. If you love my story, support this video with 19 likes. Subscribe for more twists. You won't want to miss what's next. The night was thick with a damp chill, the kind that seeped into your bones and made the world feel smaller. I stood on my porch, arms crossed tight over my chest, the rough wood creaking under my boots as red and blue lights pulsed against my new steel gate. Long shadows stretched across the cracked pavement of my driveway, flickering like ghosts in the glow of the police cruiser park just beyond. The air hummed with the low rumble of its engine, and I exhaled slow, watching my breath curl in the cold. This wasn't my first dance with Karen's theatrics, but something about tonight felt sharper, more jagged, than her usual neighborhood tantrums. 2 officers stepped out, their boots splashing in a puddle left from yesterday's rain. The older one, Sergeant Doyle, his badge said, adjusted his cap, gray hair peeking out beneath, his weathered face set in a frown that said he'd rather be anywhere else. The younger one, Rivera, hung back, his dark eyes scanning my property like he was piecing together a puzzle. Across the street, Karen was already in full swing, arms flailing like a windmill, her shrill voice cutting through the stillness. "It's a community emergency," she barked, her chubby frame swaying, her red sweatshirt clashing with the night. "He's blocking a public road. Justice needs to be served." I rubbed my temple, a dull ache blooming there. "It's not a public road," I called out, voice flat but firm, stepping off the porch onto the gravel. "It's my driveway. Private property. I've got every right to lock it." Karen scoffed, her face twisting into a scowl, her short blonde hair bobbing as she jabbed a finger at me. "That's a lie. People use it all the time. It's always been open. You can't just block it off." Her indignation was theater, but her eyes flickered with something, a panic, maybe, that I hadn't seen before. "People use it because they don't respect boundaries." I shot back, my boots crunching as I closed the gap to the gate. "Doesn't make it theirs." Doyle raised a hand, silencing us both, his frown deepening. "Sir," he said, nodding at me, "we got a report about an unauthorized obstruction. Could be a public access issue." I pointed at the thick folder on my patio table, its edges curling from years in a drawer. "Deed's right there, private since the house was built. Nothing's changed except me finally doing something about it." Rivera stepped forward, his lean frame taut, his badge glinting as he glanced at the papers. "Mr. Bishop, you got proof?" I grabbed the folder, flipping it open to the deed, the yellowed page stamped with faded ink. "Right here," I said, handing it over. Doyle skimmed it, his gray eyes flicking over the lines, then passed it back with a sigh. "Legally, he's right," he said, turning to Karen. "If it's private, he can restrict access." Her mouth dropped, her pale skin flushing an impressive red. "What? You're serious?" "This isn't over." Rivera wasn't sold, though. "With respect, sir," he said, his voice low, his dark eyes narrowing. "Why now? Why close it all of a sudden?" I hesitated, my jaw tightening. That was the question, wasn't it? For years, I let neighbors cut through, dog walkers, kids on bikes, delivery trucks, grumbling but tolerating it. Then a week ago, everything shifted. I'd been out back, digging near the driveway's edge, planning a workshop expansion, when my shovel hit something hard, smooth, reinforced concrete, buried deep under decades of dirt. Not a pipe, not a foundation, a sealed edge like a door to nowhere. That night, my security cameras caught it. 2 men in dark jackets, faces shadowed, walking the driveway at 3:27 a.m. They stopped right where I'd dug, one with bolt cutters glinting in the moonlight, the other crouching, pressing hands to the dirt like he knew what was under there. They clipped my fence lock, swapped it with a cheap knockoff, then vanished. The next morning, I found the tampering, subtle, but deliberate. I rewound the tape, frame by frame, my gut twisting. Karen's hushed, urgent whispers to a neighbor later that day only fueled it, She kept glancing at my house, at that spot, her usual smugness replaced with something edgy. I didn't tell the cops any of that. Got tired of trespassers, I said instead, shrugging, my voice steady despite the prickle on my neck. Thought it was time to set boundaries. Doyle studied me, his gray eyes sharp, but said nothing. Rivera frowned, unconvinced, and gestured to the gate. Mind if we take a look? I waved a hand. Be my guest. They walked over, inspecting the heavy-duty steel, new, gleaming, bolted tight last week. Karen hissed, her voice a venomous spike. He's hiding something. Why else lock it now? I turned, lowering my voice, so only she heard. I built this because I don't want people on my land, Karen. You've got no say. Her eyes flickered. Fear, maybe, or something deeper, then hardened. As the cops poked around, a black SUV rolled past, slow and deliberate, its tinted windows swallowing the streetlight's glare. It didn't stop, but Rivera's jaw tightened, his hand brushing his holster. I caught it too, the same unease I'd felt watching my footage. Doyle waved them off soon after, the deed trumping Karen's rant. But as they drove away and she stormed home, I stood there, the gate's shadow pooling around me. Something was off, something bigger than a nosy neighbor. Whatever I'd uncovered wasn't just concrete. It was a secret, and someone didn't want me near it. The night deepened after the cops left, the red and blue lights fading into a memory as silence settled over Juniper Lane. I sat in my workshop, a cluttered shed tacked onto the house, hunched over my desk, the glow of the security monitor casting a cold blue sheen across my face. The footage looped, grainy but sharp enough to haunt me. Two figures at 3:27 a.m., dark jackets swallowing their shapes, one with bolt cutters glinting like a blade, the other crouched low, hands pressed to the dirt where I'd dug. My fingers tightened on the mouse, rewinding frame by frame, the timestamp ticking back. They'd stood there, right above that buried concrete, then slipped away like smoke. I leaned back, the chair creaking under me, and rubbed my eyes, the ache in my temples pulsing harder. The shed smelled of sawdust and old oil, tools scattered across the workbench. A drill, a crowbar, a half-finished shelf I'd abandoned when this mess started. Outside, the gate stood firm, its steel glinting faintly under the porch light, a barrier I'd built to reclaim what was mine. But now, staring at those shadows on the screen, it felt less like protection and more like a target painted on my back. A low hum broke the quiet, an engine, steady and deliberate, rolling past the house. I snapped upright, peering through the shed's grimy window. A black SUV crept down the street, its tinted windows swallowing the moonlight, its pace slow enough to make my gut twist. I grabbed my phone, thumbing to the live feed. 9 p.m., and there it was circling the block. My pulse kicked up, the prickle on my neck sharpening. I rewound the tape again, catching it at midnight, then dawn, 3 passes in one night, each time slowing near my driveway. The plates were a blur, but the intent wasn't. Someone was watching. I shut off the screen, the darkness swallowing the shed, and stepped outside, boots crunching on gravel. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine from the trees lining my property. Across the street, Karen's house was dark, her curtains still, no flailing arms, no shrill accusations tonight. But I remembered her yesterday, whispering to a neighbor, her eyes darting to my land, her usual smugness edged with something nervous. Did she know what I'd found? I shook my head, shoving the thought down. She was a pest, not a conspirator, right? Sleep wouldn't come, not with that SUV looping in my mind. So I stayed up, the crowbar cold in my hand as I paced the porch. Dawn broke gray and sluggish, the sky bruised with clouds, when a sharp knock jolted me awake. Still in my chair, neck stiff, the crowbar across my lap. I stumbled up, pulling on a t-shirt, and peered through the peephole. Rivera stood there, arms crossed, his lean frame taut in his uniform, his dark eyes unreadable under the brim of his cap. Not the wake-up call I wanted. I cracked the door, the cold seeping in. "Officer," I said, voice rough with sleep. "Something I can help you with?" He didn't answer right away, glancing toward the gate, then back at me, his jaw tight. Can we talk inside? I hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him in. He strode in my living room like he'd mapped it out, turning to face me as I shut the door. I need you to tell me exactly what you found, he said, his voice low, cutting through the morning haze. My muscles tensed. You saw the deed. It's my property. What I do with it's my business. Rivera sighed, rubbing his jaw, his dark eyes sharp. I know the law, Bishop, but I also know you're holding back. After last night, I need to know if you're in danger. I narrow my eyes. After last night, he didn't flinch, pulling his phone from his jacket and swiping to a grainy dash cam shot. For 17 a.m., that black SUV parked 2 blocks away, its outline stark against the streetlight. My jaw tightened. You followed it. Rivera shook his head. Caught it on patrol. Thought it was odd. Ran the plates. He paused, his dark eyes locking on mine. No registration. Not in any database. Just a blank record. A chill ran through me, the shed's footage flashing in my head. Those figures, that clipped lock. So, it's not just some nosy neighbor, I said, voice low. He nodded, his face grim. That's why I'm here. What's under that driveway? I swallowed, debating how much to give. Lying felt pointless. He'd seen the SUV, felt the same unease. I walked to the patio door, pulling back the curtain, and pointed to the far end of my property, where the dirt still bore my shovel marks. It's not just a driveway, I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. There's something underneath, concrete, sealed old. I don't know how deep, but it wasn't meant to be found. Rivera followed my gaze, his dark eyes narrowing, his hand brushing his holster like a reflex. You uncovered it. Part of it, I said, enough to know it's not random. He exhaled slow, his face unreadable. I need to see it. I tensed, boots scuffing the floor. Not a good idea. Why not? I turned, meeting his stare. Because someone else doesn't want it seen, and they're watching. For the first time, Rivera looked rattled, his dark eyes flickering to the window, then back to me. You think that SUV knows what you found? I don't think, I said, my voice hard. I know. He was quiet, then nodded, his jaw clenching. Show me. Now. I hesitated, letting him admit dragging him into this, whatever this was, but keeping it solo felt riskier after last night. Fine, I said, grabbing my jacket. But we do it my way. No backup, no calls. Just us. He nodded, his dark eyes steady, and we stepped outside, the morning air biting at my skin. The gate loomed ahead, a steel sentinel, but beyond it, the disturbed dirt waited, cold, silent, hiding something I couldn't unfind. As we moved, I felt it again, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down, waiting. Whatever was under there wasn't just a relic, it was alive, and I just kicked the hornet's nest. The morning air hung still and heavy as Rivera and I slipped out my back door, the crunch of gravel under our boots the only sound breaking the silence. The sky was a dull gray slab, clouds pressing low over Juniper Lane, casting the world in a muted haze. I led the way, my jacket zipped tight against the chill, my breath fogging in short bursts. Rivera followed, his lean frame tense in his uniform, his dark eyes darting to the tree line, hand hovering near his holster like a coiled spring. The tarp-covered patch waited at the far end of my property, a silent scar in the dirt where I'd first struck that concrete edge, a secret I couldn't undig. I crouched, pulling back the tarp with a slow scrape, revealing the smooth, cold slab beneath. It gleamed faintly under the weak light, untouched by time. It seemed a thin, deliberate line. Rivera knelt beside me, his dark hair catching a stray breeze, his fingers tracing the edge. This isn't normal, he muttered, his voice low, his dark eyes narrowing. Insulated, reinforced, feels cold deeper than it should. My stomach twisted, the weight of his words sinking in. It's not just concrete, I said, my voice steady but tight. There's metal under there, dense, solid. I don't know what it is, but it's old. He pressed his palm against it, frowning, his face shadowed with unease. This wasn't built to be found, he said, standing abruptly, scanning the trees. Military, maybe, or something else. I nodded, dusting my hands on my jeans, the prickle on my neck sharpening. That's the problem. Before he could reply, a low hum cut through the quiet. An engine, slow, and deliberate. We froze, heads snapping toward the street. A black SUV rolled past, not the same one from Rivera's dashcam, but close enough. Tinted windows, no plates visible, its pace a taunt. My pulse hammered, the air thickening with the weight of unseen eyes. Rivera's hand brushed his holster, his jaw clenching. "They're not subtle anymore," he said, his dark eyes tracking the vehicle until it vanished around the bend. "Got a plate?" I asked, voice low. He pulled his phone, checking the live feed, then shook his head, his face grim. "Blurry. Registered to a government fleet. No agency listed. Same as last night." My chest tightened. So, they're not hiding there here, just who they are. He turned back to the slab, his dark eyes hard. "We need to know what's under there now." I grabbed the crowbar, stashed nearby, its cold steel grounding me, and jammed it into the seam. "On three," I said, bracing my boots. He gripped it too, his lean hand steady. 1, 2. We heaved, muscles straining, the slab groaning as it shifted an inch, a thin gap yawning open. A stale gust rushed out, sharp and musty, like air trapped for decades. My skin prickled. This wasn't just a bunker. A sharp knock echoed from the house, cutting through the tension like a blade. Rivera's hand flew to his gun, his dark eyes snapping to me. "Stay here," he muttered, stepping toward the sound, but I followed, crowbar tight in my grip. Through the peephole, I saw her, Karen, arms crossed, her red sweatshirt glaring against the gray dawn, her chubby face pale, her short blonde hair wild. Not her usual smug self. She looked rattled, eyes darting like a cornered animal. Rivera opened the door a crack, his voice low. "What do you want?" She pushed past him, stepping inside, her pale skin flushed with panic. "We need to talk. Now," she said, her voice trembling, locking eyes with me. I frowned, boots scuffing the floor. "About what?" She took a shaky breath, her hands twisting together. "Them. The people watching you." My blood ran cold, the shed's footage flashing. "Those figures, the SUV. What do you know?" I demanded, stepping closer. She swallowed hard, her blue eyes wide. "I don't know who they are, but they've been watching for a while. They don't like questions." Rivera's dark eyes narrowed, his hand still near his holster. "What do you mean?" Karen rubbed her arms, her voice dropping. "My brother, he worked real estate years back. Assessed this land, found something off. Records didn't match, like it was never meant for private sale. Then men in suits showed up. 2 days later, his office burned down. He quit, never spoke of it again." My pulse pounded, the slab's cold edge sharp in my mind. "And you're telling me now?" She glared, fear cracking her usual venom. "I saw the SUV last night, outside my house, 2 a.m. Someone stood there, watching your property, then looked at my window like they knew I was awake." Rivera shifted, his dark eyes flicking to me. "They're tightening the grip." I turned to Karen, voice low. "Why come here?" Her lips pressed thin, her pale face hardening. "Because if they're after me for knowing too much, you're in deeper. They're waiting for your next move." My stomach twisted. She'd been a thorn, but now she was scared, and that made this real. Rivera's jaw clenched. "We're running out of time." I grabbed my keys, the crowbar still in hand. "Then we go back, see what's under there." Karen paled, her voice a hiss. "Are you insane?" "They'll see. They already know," I said, meeting her stare. "We're past hiding." Rivera nodded, his dark eyes steady. "No backup, just us." Karen cursed, but followed, her red sweatshirt a reluctant flag, as we slipped out back. The tarp loomed ahead, the slab's gap a dark promise. I felt it again, those unseen eyes, heavier now, closer. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just buried. It was waiting, and we were about to find out why. The air grew colder as we slipped back to the tarp, the gray dawn barely piercing the thick canopy of pines that edged my property. My boots sank into the soft earth, the crowbar heavy in my grip, its steel a cold anchor against the unease coiling in my gut. Rivera moved ahead, his lean frame taut in his uniform, his dark eyes scanning the shadows, flashlight in one hand, the other brushing his holster. Karen trailed behind, her chubby silhouette stiff in her red sweatshirt, her short blonde hair catching faint glints of light, her pale face tight with dread. The slab waited beneath the tarp, its dark gap a silent dare, exhaling that stale, musty breath into the stillness. I crouched, peeling the tarp back further, the fabric rasping against the dirt. The concrete gleamed, smooth and unyielding. It seemed wider now from our earlier pull. Rivera knelt beside me, his flashlight beam slicing into the blackness below, revealing a metal ladder, rusted but solid, descending into shadow. "This isn't just a bunker," he muttered, his voice low, his dark eyes narrowing as the light danced off the reinforced walls. "It's too intact, too deliberate." My pulse hammered, the slab's cold edge pressing into my mind. "Let's find out," I said, jamming the crowbar deeper into the gap. Karen hovered, arms crossed tight, her blue eyes wide with panic. "Are you insane?" she hissed, her voice sharp but trembling. "They're watching, they'll see." I shot her a look, my jaw clenching. "They already know we're here, Karen. No point stopping now." Rivera nodded, his dark hair ruffling as he gripped the crowbar with me. "On three," he said, his lean hands steady. 1, 2. We heaved, muscles straining, the slab groaning as it shifted another inch, then gave a deep, hollow whoosh rushing out like a sigh from a sealed tomb. My skin prickled, the air thick with age and something metallic. Rivera aimed his flashlight down, the beam cutting through the dark, illuminating the ladder's descent into a narrow corridor, smooth, metal-lined, untouched by time. "I'll go first," he said, his voice tight, slinging the light over his shoulder. I nodded, crowbar in hand, as he stepped onto the rungs, the metal creaking under his weight. Karen cursed under her breath, her pale face paling further, but followed, her red sweatshirt a reluctant flare in the gloom. I went last, the ladder cold against my palms, each step echoing with a faint clang as we dropped deeper. The air turned frigid, heavy with that stale tang, the walls closing in, smooth steel, marked by faded warning signs and a script I couldn't read. My boots hit solid ground, the corridor stretching ahead, a tunnel frozen in time. Rivera's flashlight swept the space, revealing thick cables snaking along the floor, dust coating everything but a faint path worn clean. Someone had been here recently. Karen pressed close, her breathing shallow, her blue eyes darting. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, voice barely audible. I strained my ears. Nothing at first, then a low hum, mechanical and distant, vibrating through the walls. Rivera's dark eyes met mine, his jaw clenching. "It's coming from ahead," he said, stepping toward a rusted door at the corridor's end, the hum growing louder. He brushed the handle, unlocked, a detail that made my stomach twist. "Someone's been down here," I said, voice low, the crowbar tight in my grip. He nodded, pushing the door open with a slow creak. The room beyond was small, a relic of another era. Outdated computer terminals lined the walls, screens flickering with static, cables tangled like veins. A control panel hummed faintly, its keyboard wiped clean of dust, the only spot not layered in grime. Karen let out a sharp breath, her pale face stark in the dim light. "This was supposed to be abandoned, right?" I stepped closer, running a hand over the panel, the hum pulsing under my fingertips. "It's got power," I said, my voice steady but edged. "It's still connected." Rivera pulled out his phone. No signal, his dark eyes narrowing as he pocketed it. "No way to call this in." I scanned the floor. Faded papers, brittle with age, scattered like leaves. I grabbed one, the ink smudged, but legible, Cyrillic, Russian. Rivera leaned over, his face grim. "Soviet," he said, wiping grime from a logo on the panel, its hammer and sickle faint but unmistakable. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some old utility hatch. It was something buried, something foreign, something alive. Karen backed up, her red sweatshirt brushing the wall, her blue eyes wide with terror. "A Soviet bunker under your damn driveway? We need to go now." I turned, voice low. "We're in this, Karen. No turning back." A clang echoed down the corridor, sharp, deliberate, followed by the faint scuff of footsteps. Rivera snapped off his flashlight, his dark eyes flashing to me, hand on his gun. "We're not alone," he whispered, motioning for silence. My fingers tightened on the crowbar, my breath shallow, the hum pulsing louder now, syncing with my heartbeat. Karen froze, her pale face a mask of fear, her hands trembling. The footsteps grew closer, slow, measured, echoing off the steel. Rivera edged toward the door, his lean frame coiled, but I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. "Wait," I mouthed, pointing to the panel. Its static screen flickered, a shadow passing briefly across it, then gone. The footsteps stopped, the silence heavier than the dark. Whoever was out there knew we were here, watching, waiting. I felt it in my bones. This wasn't the end. It was the edge of something bigger, something we'd only scratched, and it wasn't letting us go. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. The hum of the Soviet bunker's control panel, a steady pulse beneath the steel floor. I gripped the crowbar, its cold weight slick with my sweat, my breath shallow as the echo of those footsteps lingered in the corridor beyond. Rivera stood rigid by the rusted door, his lean frame a shadow in the dim flicker of the static screens, his dark eyes locked on the gap, gun drawn now, flashlight off. Karen pressed against the wall, her chubby form trembling in her red sweatshirt, her short blonde hair plastered to her pale forehead, her blue eyes wide with terror. The air was frigid, heavy with that stale, metallic tang, and every sound, the hum, our breathing, the distant drip of water, felt amplified, a countdown ticking in my chest. Rivera's whisper cut through, sharp and low. "They're close, too close." His dark hair clung to his brow, his jaw clenched tight, his gun steady despite the tremor I saw in his grip. I nodded, shifting the crowbar, my boots scuffing the floor as I edged toward the panel. The static screen flickered again, a shadow darting across it. Brief, blurred, gone. My pulse hammered, the realization sinking in. Whoever was out there wasn't just watching from above anymore. They were here, in the deep with us. Karen's voice cracked, barely a hiss. "We need to go now." Her pale hands clutched her arms, her red sweatshirt a stark splash against the gray steel, her blue eyes darting to the door. "They'll kill us." I shot her a look, my voice low but hard. "We're past running, Karen. They know we're here." She shrank back, her face paling further, but stayed put, fear rooting her as much as it drove her. Rivera eased the door open a sliver, peering into the corridor, his dark eyes narrowing. "Nothing yet," he muttered, but the footsteps resumed, slow, deliberate, closer now, a faint metallic scrape trailing them. My stomach twisted, boots on steel, maybe, or something heavier. I scanned the room, the terminals humming, their cables snaking into the walls like veins. Papers littered the floor, Russian scrawl, faded maps, a logo I didn't recognize beyond the Soviet mark. I grabbed one, shoving it into my pocket, the brittle edge crumbling in my hand. "We need something, proof," I said, my voice steady despite the shake in my fingers. The footsteps stopped, the silence heavier than before, pressing against my ribs. Rivera's gun clicked softly as he adjusted his grip, his dark eyes flicking to me. "If they come through that door, we're cornered." I nodded, scanning for another way out, a vent, a hatch, anything, but the room was a box, sealed tight, except for that corridor. The hum spiked, the panel static crackling louder, and I turned, my flashlight catching a faint red light blinking on the keyboard. Active, alive. Karen whimpered, her pale face glistening with sweat. "What's that?" I stepped closer, the crowbar raised, and brushed the keys dust-free used. The screen flared, static parting to reveal a grainy feed. My driveway, the gate, the tarp, live from above. My breath caught, the image shifting, a shadow moving near the slab. Then another, dark figure circling my house like wolves. "They got eyes up there," I said, voice low, my chest tightening. "They've been watching every move." Rivera swore under his breath, his dark eyes flashing to the screen, then the door. "They knew we'd come down here." The footsteps started again, Faster now, a purposeful stride, metal clanging louder. Karen backed into the corner, her red sweatshirt brushing a cable, her blue eyes wild. We're trapped. I gripped the crowbar tighter, my mind racing. Fight or hide. No time to think. A new sound cut through, a low groan, mechanical, from deeper in the bunker. The floor vibrated, a faint tremor shaking dust from the ceiling, the hum surging into a whine. Rivera's flashlight swept the walls, catching a seam, a hidden panel, barely visible, rattling as the noise grew. There's something else here, he said, his voice sharp, his lean frame coiling toward it. I jammed the crowbar into the seam, prying with a grunt, the metal screeching as it gave. An inch, then more, revealing a dark shaft beyond, cables plunging into blackness. The footsteps were at the door now, boots heavy, stopping just outside. A shadow fell across the gap, long and still, the hum drowning my heartbeat. Rivera grabbed Karen's arm, pulling her toward the shaft, his dark eyes fierce. "Move!" he hissed, shoving her in. She stumbled, her red sweatshirt snagging, a muffled cry escaping as she slid down. I followed, the crowbar clattering as I squeezed through, Rivera behind me, his gun scraping the steel. We dropped into darkness, the shaft narrow and cold, cables brushing my face as we slid 10 feet, maybe more, landing hard on a grated floor. The air was thicker here, the hum deafening, a red glow pulsing from ahead, a chamber vast and shadowed, machines whirring in the gloom. Karen huddled beside me, her pale face streaked with grime, her blue eyes locked on the shaft above. Rivera stood, his dark eyes scanning, gun raised, his breath ragged. Above, the panel slammed shut, a metallic clang sealing us in. The footsteps didn't follow, not yet, but a new sound rose, a low, rhythmic thud like something waking up deep in the bunker's heart. I gripped the crowbar, my flashlight trembling, the red glow ahead flickering with shapes I couldn't make out, tall still waiting. "We're not alone," Rivera whispered, his dark eyes glinting in the dim, his lean frame braced. Karen's voice shook, barely audible. "What is this?" I didn't answer, my gaze fixed on the shadows, moving now, subtle, deliberate. Whatever I'd uncovered, it wasn't just a relic. It was alive, watching, and we'd walked right into its lair, with no way back and no end in sight.